The knock at the door was polite, not the kind you'd expect from armed federal agents about to arrest a fugitive. It was controlled, almost courteous, just like the man they were about to apprehend. A middle-aged woman peered through the peephole of the modest brick house, her brow furrowing in confusion. Her husband wasn't expecting visitors. She cracked the door open slightly. Yes. The man outside, clad in a suit and tie, flashed a badge. "Ma'am, is your husband home?" A moment later, a man in his 60s shuffled toward the door, wearing thick-rimmed glasses and an expression of mild curiosity. He was mild-mannered, polite, and utterly unremarkable. To everyone in Richmond, Virginia, he was Robert Peter Clark, an accountant with a quiet demeanor and an unshakable sense of routine. But to the FBI, he was John Emil List, one of the most wanted men in America. For 18 years, he had lived under an alias, started a new life, and remarried. He had blended into the background, a man of rules, of habit, of faith, and now it was over. John List adjusted his glasses and frowned at the agents. "I believe you have the wrong person." The lead agent, who had seen hundreds of guilty men feign innocence, didn't flinch. "We know exactly who you are, Mr. List." For the first time in nearly 2 decades, John List's world crumbled. As he was led away in handcuffs, the life he had so carefully reconstructed collapsed around him. But how did he get here? To understand John List's capture, we need to go back to the perfect suburban home, back to the picture-perfect family, back to the day he decided to end it all. John List liked order. Order meant control. And control, that was the only way to survive in a world teetering towards sin. His home at 431 Hillside Avenue was a 19-room mansion, complete with a ballroom, towering bookshelves, and a watchful stare from every stained glass window. A house fit for a God-fearing family, for respectable people. John sat at the dining room table, meticulously reviewing bills and expenses, and the dwindling bank account statements. He pressed a hand to his temple, adjusting his glasses with a slow, deliberate motion. They were running out of money. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had done everything right. He had fought in the war, gone to college, built a career as an accountant, but now, at 46 years old, his once promising career was failing. And there was something else, something more corrosive than financial ruin. His family was slipping away from him. His wife, Helen, had grown resentful, bitter. She was ill, her health declining, her moods unpredictable. She drank too much and criticized him constantly. She mocked his strict religious devotion, rolling her eyes whenever he muttered his nightly prayers. And the children? They were drifting from God. His eldest, Patricia, only 16, spoke openly of becoming an actress, a profession of vanity and sin. John Jr. was 15, and though he showed some promise in sports, he was growing distant and had begun questioning things. The youngest, Frederick, only 13, still obeyed without question, but John feared it was only a matter of time. And then there was his mother, Alma, living in her private apartment on the 3rd floor, always watching, always reminding him of his duty to lead this family the right way. John List sat at the table, hands folded, a storm raging behind his calm expression. There was only one way to fix this, only one way to make sure his family was saved. They couldn't face poverty, humiliation, and sin. They couldn't live with failure, but maybe, just maybe, they could die with dignity. In the weeks leading up to November 9th, 1971, John List moved methodically. He stopped depositing money into the bank, letting the mortgage slip. He canceled newspaper subscriptions, subtly cutting off any future deliveries. He informed the children's schools that the family would be moving to North Carolina to care for a sick relative for a while. He stole his mother's key to her safety deposit box, ensuring access to what little money she had left. And finally, he bought a gun. On the morning of November 9th, John List woke up earlier than usual. He dressed in his finest suit, the same way he always had before a normal workday. Except today, he wasn't going to work. Helen was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, barely acknowledging his presence. "John," she muttered, rubbing her temples, "you're up early." "I have some things to take care of," he said, his voice steady. Helen barely nodded. She reached for her coffee cup again, and that's when he raised the gun and shot her in the back of the head. She never saw it coming. The coffee spilled onto the floor, the cup shattering. John stood there for a moment, watching her slump forward, blood pooling across the table. Then, without a word, he walked upstairs. His mother, Alma, was in her apartment, waiting for breakfast. When John entered, she smiled. "Oh, John." The gun flashed, and she collapsed instantly. John turned and left his mother's body in her apartment, carrying on with his plan. The next few hours were excruciating. John paced the house, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock. The smell of gunpowder and blood lingered in the air, but the house itself, it was silent, too silent. He sat at the dining room table, hands folded, waiting. And then, just after 3 p.m., the front door creaked open. John's 16-year-old daughter, Patricia, stepped inside. The air felt strange. Something was off. "Mom, Dad," she called. John emerged from the dining room. "Patty, come here." Before Patty had time to respond, John raised the gun and fired. Patricia collapsed before she could even scream. John's youngest son, Frederick, was next. He did not even have time to register what was happening before John turned the gun on him and fired. John then moved his wife's and children's bodies into the mansion's ballroom and placed them on sleeping bags on the floor. He took a break and made himself lunch before leaving the mansion and heading to the bank to close both his and his mother's accounts. But there was still one last task in his plan to complete. At 4 p.m., John Jr. was still alive, running up and down the soccer field, shouting plays with his teammates. His father had watched the entire game, sitting stiffly in the stands like any other proud parent. John Jr. had no idea that his family was already dead. After the game, he rode home with his friend's parents, unaware that his father was already home, waiting for him. When he walked through the door, he barely had time to take off his jacket before John raised the gun and fired. The first bullet hit his chest, but John Jr. didn't die instantly. He fought. Unlike the others, John Jr. struggled, clawing toward his father, trying to stop him. John fired again, and again, and again. It took 10 bullets before John Jr. finally stopped moving. John dragged him into the ballroom to lay him beside his siblings and his mother. John List wasn't done yet. He adjusted the thermostat, lowering it to slow decomposition. He turned on classical music, setting it on repeat. He wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, explaining that he had spared his family from the evils of the world. Then he cleaned the crime scene, wiping down doorknobs, counters, and the gun. To ensure that no face could be connected to the crime, John destroyed every picture of himself in the home. Then he sat down and ate dinner. He slept in the house overnight, his murdered family lined up in the ballroom. John List woke up early the next morning, just as he had every morning for decades. But today was different. Today, he woke up a free man. The mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue was silent, save for the low hum of classical music still playing softly in the ballroom. He turned on every light in the house, double-checked his briefcase, making sure his passport, fake identification, and cash savings were tucked safely inside. Then he walked out the door. He didn't hesitate as he climbed into his Chevrolet Impala and started the engine. As he pulled away from the house, he was already thinking ahead. He had mapped this out, planned every detail. The bodies would be found eventually, but by then, he would be long gone, lost in the current of America's endless highways. And with that, John List disappeared. For weeks, no one noticed. John had stopped all mail and newspaper deliveries, and cut the milk service. Life around the mansion went on as usual until neighbors started to suspect that something was off. While the family was somewhat reclusive, none of them had been seen in a month. The lights in the home were on, but there never seemed to be any movement. However, when the neighbors noticed the lights inside flickering out, one by one, their suspicions grew. By December 7th, 1971, a month after the murders, police were finally called to check on the house. When they entered, they were immediately hit with the overwhelming stench of death. The air was thick with decay, the silence pressing. Then, in the grand ballroom, they found them: Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, all lined up neatly, hands folded, as if waiting for a final blessing. Their bodies lay side by side, arranged in an eerily methodical manner. They found Alma in her apartment upstairs, but John List was nowhere to be found. For the next several weeks after the murders, John List didn't stay in one place for more than a few days. He drove south, avoiding major highways, stopping at small roadside motels, always paying in cash. He lived like a ghost, leaving no trail. Every morning, he shaved meticulously, combed his graying hair, and adjusted his glasses, maintaining his neat, unassuming appearance. He kept to himself, speaking to as few people as possible. He ate at cheap diners, reading the newspaper obsessively, scanning for news of his family's discovery. He avoided television, knowing his face would be everywhere once police realized he had vanished. Some nights, he didn't risk a motel at all. Instead, he parked on quiet residential streets and slept in his car, careful to move before dawn. He rationed his money, surviving off the cash he had stolen from his mother's bank account. By December, news of the Westfield murders had exploded nationwide. He saw his own name and face staring back at him from headlines in gas stations and convenience stores. He didn't panic. Instead, he kept moving. By early 1972, he had reached Denver, Colorado. He knew he couldn't live as John List anymore, and so, in Denver, John List ceased to exist. John List forged a new identity with the same level of precision and calculation he had used in planning the murders. Under the alias Robert Peter Clark, he carefully began constructing a normal life, a faceless man in a sea of strangers. At first, he took whatever work he could find: bookkeeping for small businesses, odd jobs as a freelance accountant. He was methodical, patient, slowly building up his new persona. He rented a modest apartment, kept to himself, and never shared too much. When asked about his past, he had a simple and effective explanation. "I'm a widower. My wife died of cancer. Just needed a fresh start." No one questioned it. And just like that, John List was gone. By 1985, John List, now permanently known as Bob Clark, was settled. He had a stable job as an accountant, a quiet routine, and no suspicion attached to his name. The murders of his family were now a distant crime, a case growing colder by the day. Then he met Dolores Miller. She was a widow in her early 50s, kind, soft-spoken, and practical. She had no wild ambitions, no rebellious streak. In many ways, she was the perfect woman for him, a person who wouldn't question him too much, who wouldn't poke at the past. John List courted her the way he did everything else, slowly, deliberately, carefully. He was respectable, he was stable, he was dependable. And in 1985, after just over a year of dating, they married. Dolores believed she had found a good man, a husband who was devoted, responsible, and steady. She had no idea that the man she slept beside every night had murdered his entire family in cold blood. For the next 4 years, John List lived what seemed to be a perfectly normal life. He and Dolores bought a small brick house in Midlothian, Virginia, a quiet suburb near Richmond. He attended church regularly, blending in with the congregation, and he worked as an accountant, making just enough to maintain a modest lifestyle. He followed a strict, predictable routine, ensuring no one ever had a reason to question him. The world had forgotten him. He had escaped. Or so he thought. By 1989, the Westfield Mansion murders had faded into true crime legend, but law enforcement hadn't forgotten. That year, a popular American crime television show called America's Most Wanted picked up the case, enlisting forensic artist Frank Bender to create a clay bust of what John List might look like nearly 2 decades later. The bust was uncannily accurate, right down to the thick-rimmed glasses, the receding hairline, the wrinkles of a life well hidden. On May 21, 1989, the episode aired on national television, and in Richmond, Virginia, a neighbor of Bob Clark was watching. They stared at the screen, then at the man they had known for years. Then, one by one, people began calling the FBI tip line to report that the cold-blooded murderer on their screen was their quiet, non-assuming neighbor, Bob. When FBI agents arrived at Bob Clark's home, he answered the door like any other day. He was calm, polite, and collected, even when they told him, "We know exactly who you are." Even when they placed him in handcuffs. Even when they told Dolores her husband was not Bob Clark, but John Emil List, a mass murderer. Dolores stood in shock, unable to comprehend that the man she had loved for 4 years was a cold-blooded killer. As he was led away, John List didn't struggle. He only adjusted his glasses. At his trial in 1990, John List showed no emotion. He calmly explained that he had killed his family to spare them from financial ruin and moral corruption. He said he believed he would be reunited with them in heaven. At least now, they are safe with God, he told the court. The jury wasn't moved. John List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms in prison. He died in prison in 2008 at the age of 82, never once admitting that he had done anything wrong. For 18 years, John List lived a lie. He built a new life, a new marriage, a new identity, but the past never truly vanished. And in the end, a clay bust and a TV broadcast did what detectives and manhunts never could. They brought a killer out of the shadows. John List thought he had escaped his crimes, but in the end, the past always catches up.